Late 1944. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The Allied front is still moving, but the rhythm of decision-making has changed. Reports arrive describing opportunities that will not last. German units are shifting, defenses are thin in places, and Patton's Third Army is positioned to move immediately. From the field, the request is clear. Act now, before the moment disappears. Inside Chef, urgency carries a different weight. Eisenhower understands the value of speed, but he also sees the cost of reacting too quickly. Every immediate action draws fuel from a limited pool. Every rapid thrust affects neighboring armies and forces adjustments across the front. What looks like a local opportunity can become a theater-wide commitment. Patton's demand is not unusual. His experience has taught him that hesitation gives the enemy time to recover. Earlier in the campaign, immediate action had paid dividends. Now, Eisenhower must decide whether those conditions still apply. No refusal is issued. No blanket approval is granted. Instead, Eisenhower considers what can be allowed without letting urgency dictate strategy. The question is no longer whether action should be taken, but how much freedom that action can be given without undermining coordination, logistics, and coalition balance. The decision forming at Chef is measured, not dramatic. What Eisenhower allows will shape not only the next movement of the front, but the boundaries within which momentum itself is permitted to operate. Patton's demand for immediate action did not emerge in a vacuum. It was the product of a campaign that had repeatedly rewarded speed, often more decisively than careful sequencing. During the summer of 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy transformed the nature of the war in Western Europe. Once German defenses collapsed, the campaign shifted rapidly from deliberate assault to pursuit. Units that moved fastest denied the enemy time to regroup, reorganize, or establish coherent defensive lines. Patton's Third Army was optimized for this phase. Its command culture emphasized initiative, rapid orders, and constant forward pressure. As German forces withdrew across France, Patton's formations advanced at a pace that frequently exceeded Allied planning assumptions. Towns, road junctions, and crossings fell before German commanders could coordinate resistance. In this environment, Eisenhower's immediate action was not impatience. It was a proven method of control. Eisenhower supported this approach because the system could still absorb its effects. German command structures were fragmented. Allied supply difficulties existed, but they were temporarily concealed by success. Coordination challenges mattered less when the enemy lacked the ability to exploit them. Speed compensated for friction across the front. By September 1944, that balance began to shift. The Allied advance had outrun its logistics. Fuel shortages became chronic rather than episodic. Ports capable of supporting sustained operations were still being secured and repaired. Rail networks remained damaged, forcing reliance on long and vulnerable truck routes. Eisenhower was compelled to make trade-offs that could no longer be postponed. Every rapid movement required resources that had to be denied elsewhere. Coalition dynamics further complicated decision-making. Eisenhower commanded not a single national force, but an alliance. British formations pursued their own operational priorities. French authorities sought to restore sovereignty over liberated territory. The broad front strategy Eisenhower enforced was designed not only to defeat Germany, but to preserve unity and legitimacy within the alliance. Concentrating momentum in one sector risked political imbalance, even when it produced tactical gains. Patton's operational logic, however, remained consistent. German resistance continued to appear uneven. In some sectors, defenses were improvised and thinly held. To Patton, these were fleeting opportunities that demanded immediate exploitation. Delay, in his view, you risked allowing the enemy to stabilize. His demands for action reflected battlefield realities that still seemed to favor speed. Eisenhower's perspective was shaped by accumulation rather than immediacy. He saw how each rapid advance forced reactive adjustments elsewhere. Air support had to be reassigned. Supply convoys were rerouted on short notice. Adjacent armies reshaped their plans to accommodate movements they did not initiate. The system increasingly reacted to urgency rather than directing it. The German Ardennes Counteroffensive in December 1944 reinforced Eisenhower's caution. Although ultimately defeated, the attack demonstrated how optimism and overextension could create vulnerabilities on a theater scale. It revealed the dangers of momentum that exceeded coordination and control. Eisenhower emerged from the Ardennes with heightened sensitivity to actions that appeared tactically sound but strategically brittle. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Allied mission had expanded again. The objective was no longer liberation alone, but penetration into Germany itself. Political stakes increased accordingly. Decisions about who advanced where and under what authority carried implications for occupation and post-war governance. Immediate action now generated consequences far beyond the battlefield. Patton's Third Army remained aggressive and capable. Its requests for immediate action reflected genuine opportunities, but the environment in which those requests were made had changed. Eisenhower's responsibility was to decide not simply whether action was justified, but whether it could be allowed without undermining the system sustaining the campaign. This was the context in which Patton demanded immediacy and Eisenhower weighed permission. The question was no longer whether speed could produce results, but whether those results could be absorbed without destabilizing the alliance and the strategy guiding it. From Patton's perspective, the demand for immediate action was a professional reflex rather than an act of defiance. His experience suggested that German forces, when pressured continuously, lost coherence faster than they could restore it. Delay, in his view, was not neutral. It favored the enemy. Orders issued quickly preserved initiative and kept German commanders reacting instead of planning. For Patton, urgency was discipline. Eisenhower evaluated that urgency through a different responsibility. As Supreme Allied Commander, he had to consider how one army's speed affected the entire front. Immediate action in one sector altered fuel distribution, air support schedules, and the operational posture of neighboring armies. Eisenhower did not question the battlefield logic behind Patton's requests. He questioned whether the system could sustain them without generating instability elsewhere. Subordinate commanders occupied the space between these two views. Corps and division staffs under Third Army continued to prepare rapid plans, but they increasingly encountered conditions attached to approval. Immediate action now required assurances of logistical support, coordination with adjacent units, and compliance with broader sequencing. Initiative remained valued, but it had to be expressed within limits that were clearer than before. Allied political leadership viewed urgency with caution. British authorities were sensitive to perceptions of imbalance within the coalition. French leaders monitored how rapid advances translated into control over liberated territory. For them, speed carried symbolic weight. An action taken too quickly could create political facts on the ground that outpaced diplomatic agreements. Eisenhower absorbed these concerns, aware that military success without political coherence could weaken the alliance. The human dimension reinforced Eisenhower's restraint. Rapid movement placed Allied troops in constant contact with civilian populations emerging from occupation. Discipline, conduct, and visibility mattered as much as operational success. The incidents that occurred under conditions of urgency could escalate quickly, drawing attention away from the battlefield and toward questions of authority and control. Eisenhower understood that immediate action now carried reputational risk as well as tactical reward. German command interpreted Allied behavior pragmatically. When Allied urgency appeared to outpace coordination, German planners searched for seams, overextended supply lines, thinly held sectors, or opportunities to disrupt movement. As Allied actions became more conditional and synchronized, those opportunities diminished. German planning increasingly emphasized delay rather than exploitation. These perspectives reflected not a clash of personalities, but a clash of functions. Patton sought to deny the enemy time. Eisenhower sought to deny the enemy opportunity created by imbalance. Subordinate commanders sought clarity. Political leaders sought legitimacy. German command sought leverage wherever urgency exceeded control. As Patton continued to press for immediate action, Eisenhower recognized that permission itself had become the decisive instrument. What he chose to allow, and under what conditions, would determine whether urgency served the campaign or began to undermine it. The decision Eisenhower reached was neither a simple approval nor a refusal. It was a calculation shaped by the recognition that urgency could not be eliminated, but it could be governed. By late 1944, Eisenhower understood that denying Patton immediate action outright would squander real opportunities, while granting it without restraint would allow tempo to dictate strategy. What followed was a form of permission designed to absorb urgency without surrendering control. The warning signs were already visible at the procedural level. Requests for fuel were arriving with shorter timelines and higher priority markings. Air support schedules required rapid revision to accommodate sudden thrusts. Staff coordination meetings increasingly responded to movements already underway rather than guiding them. Eisenhower saw that the system was beginning to chase urgency instead of directing it. The lessons of the preceding months informed his response. The September logistics crisis had demonstrated how quickly even successful advances could stall when sustainment failed. The Ardennes Counteroffensive showed how optimism and thin margins could be exploited across an entire front. Eisenhower concluded that immediate action could only be allowed if it did not create new vulnerabilities that the enemy might exploit later. His response took the form of conditional authorization. Eisenhower allowed Patton to act, but only within parameters that preserved theater-wide balance. Resource ceilings were set, fuel allocations were capped and sequenced. Air support was assigned according to pre-agreed priorities rather than ad hoc requests. Operational boundaries were clarified to ensure that advances aligned with adjacent armies and overall intent. For Patton, the difference was subtle but decisive. Action was permitted, but it no longer expanded automatically. Immediate movements required confirmation that sustainment and coordination could keep pace. Speed was still valued, but it had to fit within a structure that Eisenhower explicitly controlled. Urgency no longer overrode the system, it passed through it. This marked the turning point. Once Eisenhower chose to allow action conditionally, alternatives narrowed. He could not revert to automatic approvals without reintroducing risks he had already identified. Nor could he tighten restrictions further without undermining operational effectiveness. Conditional permission became the stable equilibrium between speed and control. German command detected the change in Allied behavior. The pressure remained constant, but its rhythm became more predictable. Rapid thrusts were now embedded within coordinated advances that reduced exposure. Opportunities created by sudden imbalance diminished. German planning increasingly emphasized delay rather than disruption, reflecting the growing resilience of the Allied system. At the coalition level, Eisenhower's decision reassured partners. British and French leaders saw confirmation that American urgency would not override collective strategy. Authority remained centralized and deliberate. Decisions appeared measured rather than impulsive, reinforcing confidence in the alliance's command structure. This was the moment when Eisenhower's role as gatekeeper of momentum became explicit. He did not deny Patton's demand for immediate action. He reshaped what immediate action meant. From this point forward, urgency was no longer an independent force. It operated within boundaries defined by strategy, logistics, and coalition responsibility. Once that framework was established, the campaign moved forward under a new understanding. Action continued, but it was no longer unbounded. Eisenhower had allowed momentum to persist, on his terms. Once Eisenhower's conditional permission took effect, the consequences emerged gradually rather than dramatically. Patton's Third Army continued to advance, but the character of its movement changed. Immediate action was still possible, yet it no longer translated automatically into priority or expansion. Speed survived, but it now operated within limits that shaped how far and how fast it could be applied. For Third Army, the most immediate consequence was procedural discipline. Requests for fuel, air support, and reinforcements were evaluated against preset ceilings and sequencing plans. Advances could proceed, but only when sustainment and coordination were confirmed in advance. This reduced the number of sudden shifts that had previously forced reactive adjustments elsewhere along the front. Initiative remained, but it was no longer self-authorizing. Eisenhower absorbed the pressure that followed from this recalibration. Concerns from Allied governments and senior commanders were directed upward toward SHAEF rather than toward individual field leaders. By centralizing responsibility, Eisenhower insulated Patton and other commanders from political friction, while ensuring that operational urgency did not destabilize coalition relationships. Authority appeared measured and controlled, rather than driven by events. Logistical stability improved noticeably. Supply lines no longer chased rapid exploitation without preparation. Fuel shortages remained a constraint, but they became predictable. Air support schedules stabilized, allowing for better integration with ground operations. While some opportunities were deliberately passed over, fewer operations stalled due to overextension or misalignment. Across the coalition, confidence increased. British and French leadership saw confirmation that American urgency would not override agreed priorities. Planning for occupation and post-war administration advanced with fewer surprises. The appearance of balance mattered as much as the reality, and Eisenhower's management of urgency reinforced both. German command experienced the consequences indirectly. Allied pressure remained relentless, but the vulnerabilities created by sudden imbalance diminished. Attempts to exploit stretched supply lines or thinly held sectors produced fewer results. German defensive planning increasingly focused on delaying actions rather than disruptive counterblows, reflecting the growing resilience of the Allied system. Strategically, Eisenhower's decision reduced volatility. Progress continued at a measured pace, but it became harder to interrupt. Territory gained was held more securely. Coordination replaced improvisation as the defining feature of the advance. Speed continued to contribute to success, but it no longer threatened to outrun the structures that sustained it. What followed after Patton demanded immediate action was not denial, but regulation. Eisenhower allowed momentum to persist, while ensuring that it served strategic purpose rather than undermined it. By doing so, he preserved both operational effectiveness and coalition cohesion as the war moved toward its conclusion. The episode reveals a truth often hidden behind accounts of battlefield momentum. Speed alone does not determine victory in coalition war. Responsibility does. Eisenhower's response to Patton's demand for immediate action was not a rejection of aggression, but an assertion of command purpose. He understood that success in late 1944 required more than rapid movement. It required control over how success unfolded. Patton embodied a form of leadership optimized for pressure. His instinct was to deny the enemy time, believing that hesitation created danger. That instinct had served the Allied cause repeatedly. Yet as the campaign matured, the environment changed. The front widened, political stakes increased, and the costs of imbalance grew. What once appeared as opportunity could quickly become liability. Eisenhower's role was to absorb those liabilities before they translated into failure. By conditioning urgency, he transformed momentum from a personal attribute into a managed resource. Decisions no longer depended solely on initiative at the front, but on the ability of the entire system to sustain and justify movement. This was not hesitation, it was stewardship. The significance of this moment lies in what did not happen. There was no rupture in command, no public confrontation, no dramatic reversal. Instead, there was adaptation. Eisenhower preserved Patton's effectiveness by limiting his exposure to risks that exceeded the battlefield. Authority became quieter, but stronger. This episode still matters because it illustrates how victory in complex war emerges not from unrestrained action, but from calibrated choice. The most consequential decisions were not those made under fire, but those made at desks where responsibility outweighed impulse. In choosing how much freedom to allow, Eisenhower defined the difference between speed that advances a war and speed that destabilizes its outcome. The war continued forward, not faster, but safer, and ultimately, decisively.